Chapter 26. Delanik scratched at the stubble, grazing his chin as he studied the simulated topography rotating slowly before him. The hologram was crude, causing the confrontational general to fill in the details through common sense, practical knowledge, and experience. If we insert our main force here, he said, reaching to point toward the eastern edges of the valley surrounding the lake, we can force them to come to us and away from the lake itself, as you suggest, Master Voss. The diminutive man turned his top-knotted head with a slightly audible whoosh as his massive, downturned ears caught the air in their wake. Keeping any confrontation away from the lake is a priority, Vomend. We cannot disturb what is not meant to be, Quinlan Voss replied, hands on his hips and eyes locked on the same image. War often disturbs what shouldn't be, Vomend responded. Besides, Master Voss, your fears are based on myth and legend. Quinlan stifled a light chuckle as he found the irony in the statement. The same was said at one time of the Sith, he trailed off, finding the irony less comical with each passing second. We will have to place several units atop the cliffs on either side, closer to the enemy's approximated position, to draw them apart and around that lake, Master Voss. It will take time and will most definitely come with casualties. Vomend's ears twitched in his response, and Voss noted the movement with sympathy in his heart. The man was agitated. Quinlan turned to face the small Lannick. Vomend, within that lake reside spirits closely tied to the dark side of the Force. We need to avoid disturbing its waters at all costs. And you can assure me the Empire will do likewise? Vomend replied with an upturned brow. Of course I can't, Vomend, which is why splitting their forces is critical. Make them come to us, away from that body of water. Sirs, we have two descending signals, T-85 Titans, a young human female, her voice contrasting the dialogue between the two men with an excited tinge. Two divisions? Voss turned to the Lannick again. Cappy, where did those Titans originate? Vomend asked his tactical technician over his shoulder. Executor, sir. Veers will keep the divisions tight, supporting one another. Splitting them will be difficult. He trailed off in thought, returning his gaze to the hollow image again. And Vader will insist on deploying all five, Vomend. Voss added as the Lannick began to scratch at his chin with more vigor. Of course he will, Vomend added as he focused his inspection toward the western ridge of the valley. We will deploy the main force, as I have said, Vossi, and line a flanking perimeter of artillery along the valley's southern and northern rims at intervals. Hit and run from the high ground. I will assign Karg and his fleet squads close ranks with CAC support from midway up. He turned from his musings to face Voss again, and away from the lake. Sirs, Cappy interrupted again. Incoming enemy fighters. ETA, Vomend swiveled completely to face her. Currently breaching atmosphere. Landfall in less than 5 minutes, sir. Nock, do you read? Vomend spun back toward the hollow image, canting his head skyward. Gotcha, little guy, the baritone said almost cheerfully. Vomend bristled at the slight, his ears vibrating wildly. Nice. We will have issues landing every unit if we can't stem the flow of fighters. You must do your best to keep them hangared if you can, but even more so to keep that superstar destroyer on its toes to delay any further ground force deployment. Understood, Vomend. All trace of jest was gone from his voice. Relentless is also here, but Chala and Reese are drawing Tethys out. We are on approach as we speak for another run on Executor. Her movements are erratic and sloppy, so I would wager that Vader is not aboard. Just a heads up. Copy, Captain. Good run, Vomend said, returning the small hand to the stubble and casting a furtive glance toward Quinlan. If he is planetside, I'll need to be as well, Vomend, Voss said, his expression impassive but frowning in a deadly serious. Sirs? Cappy, no more bad news, please, Vomend said without turning around. I don't know what kind it is, sir. Life forms, 4 at our decant position, she said, forcing Vomend to completely turn his wrinkled brow skyward, slowly swiveling his gaze toward Quinlan's. The look asked for some explanation, but only received a shoulder shrug from the Kefar. The man's upturned hands offered sincerity that Vomend wasn't sure he appreciated. Rexy, I don't think you need the knocks anymore. Look, Komani said, her helmet lying at her feet as she watched the ships approach them from the eastern horizon, her finger pointed toward them for his benefit. Rex brought the device down to his chest as he squinted his eyes into tight hyphens, then brought the quadnox back up to his face with a grumble. Young eyes. Ahsoka choked down her intended laugh, but couldn't contain the squeal that left her lips. She raised a hand to apologize, but continued to watch on as the ships drew closer. Ani, Nara, do either of you sense anything? Ahsoka asked in a more serious tone after she composed herself. Take care while reaching out. We may find more than we expected. Ahsoka, Vader will come. He will be here if he already isn't, Nara said, turning to the Togruta with sorrow tugging her eyes downward. I, better than anyone, realize what that means for you. It is not my destiny, Nara, Ahsoka said bluntly, although she wasn't entirely sure she believed her own words. The sound of the incoming ships began to thrum through the valley as they crested the eastern ridge at staggered intervals, dropping to the ground below with dedicated dives. The lead vessel arced toward them, a noticeable deviation from its intended course. Rex's jaw dropped as he rang out various makes and models of the assembled freighters and modified haulers, most identifiable and all upgraded with thick duranium plating on their undersides. The lead vessel, a massive CEC-modified Baleen-class heavy freighter, began detaching various segments of its mid-hull landing skiffs by the dozens. Each skiff angled toward the ground below and decanted all manner of vehicles and soldiers. Artillery dating back to the Clone Wars mingled with freshly painted versions of Imperial AT-ST support walkers, gigantic Mikun heavy trackers with ground-shaking repulsors, decanted from their skiffs, and massive ion disruptors adorning the tops of their decks, were already swiveling around looking for enemy targets. Ahsoka could only look at Rex with a smile as he gave her a wink. The extensive disruptions in the dirt and sand at their feet caused them to shield their eyes from the natural projectiles, as the collective thrumming of repulsors from the landing skiffs began swirling, obfuscating debris clouds in all directions. Rex heard it first as he slowly turned toward Ahsoka. Do you hear that? She could only look up toward the massive hauler, still a kilometer distant, to the sight of penetrating floodlights piercing through the violently swirling debris clouds. Several successive clanks could be heard through the chest-pounding bass of the collective repulsors. What is that? She began to ask the old clone as a new sound joined the fray. It was faint at first as it blended in with the other audible preparations for battle, but unmistakable as the wind shifted slightly, bringing the signature roar of twin PS4 ion engines. Tai? Kawani asked, resting her helmet upon her head once more. The sounds began to mute the others upon the breeze as the deep, resonating clanking sound stopped abruptly. More than one, Rex offered, taking several steps involuntarily backward. The opening salvo they were all expecting surprised them nonetheless. A red beam of hot energy illuminated the debris clouds on its way to an unseen foe, only to be answered by twin beams of green from a forthcoming Imperial fighter that had successfully utilized the confounding clamor of preparation to mask its approach. There were no audible reports of any attempts to find their marks, but Ahsoka could not hide the sorrow that had taken over her features. The Battle of Ambria has begun, she thought to herself, although it was unclear who its participants actually were. They had come at Zar's behest to uncover the truth, only to find a wayward version of the person she thought she had destroyed months prior. These newcomers surely didn't know any of those details, so this, then, is simply a matter of two forces colliding for the sake of war. All sounds faded from her hearing as the red, orange, and yellow debris clouds were consumed with pulse and blaster fire. Green, red, and blue hyphens crisscrossed her vision field from left to right and back again, triggering her extensive memories of similar encounters during the Clone Wars. Instances she had rarely thought twice about as she would jump into the fray at her master's side, her thoughts focused only on the purification of separatist forces and the liberation of the people that called whichever planet home. How eager she had been to unleash her physical and martial weapons in those endeavors, if only because no one else would. or could at that given moment. How is this different, she asked herself blankly as some of the laser fire began finding targets. An Imperial TIE coming to a flaming halt 40 meters away. A landing skiff with a saber tank in flames crashing to the ground at a feverishly canted angle. Ahsoka turned to consider Nara, who was mouthing words with her eyes closed tight. All of this for her? The question surprised her, but only briefly as parallels to her thoughts began to take shape. She could feel a hand on her shoulder and knew without looking that Kawani would be at her side. I don't understand, Ahsoka. I can't understand it, but she needs us, Kawani said in a hushed tone meant for Ahsoka alone. Ahsoka fought the urge to whirl on the woman and criticize her for intruding on her thoughts, but only lifted a hand to squeeze Kawani slightly. Nara, she said, deciding on a slight detour of the subject, we can't stay here. She knows, Xana said softly as Ahsoka watched the Mirialan continue her chanting. She will embrace it in time. Ahsoka turned toward the spectral woman. I don't think we have much of that. A loud explosion rocked the air close to them as a flash of red and orange fire engulfed a descending skiff, hosting the crouching form of a heavily modified ATST. The skiff canted slightly before nosediving into the planet's surface, forcing rock, dust, and sand into a cratering wave of debris. However, whoever was operating the ATST would not be denied their part in coming events, as they skillfully leapt the vehicle from the skiff's edge moments before impact. I've never seen piloting like that before, Rex offered as the ATST staggered to a halt 10 meters away and swiveled its head skyward before unleashing a barrage of heavy blaster fire from its nose and side-mounted turrets, an effort to return the favor to the offending TIE fighter. Ahsoka could not help but wince with each screeching bolt released from its cannons as the sounds of war again penetrated her memories. The wars of a multitude of incoming fighters pierced their way into her thoughts, her mind active in drumming up some imaginable visual of herself from 20 years prior. Again, she could feel herself being pulled from the auditory reports of reality around her, her mind delving further into memory at the expense of rationality and oath. Without thought, she tore from her stance straight for the two-legged walker, pausing only briefly to bound her way up its legs, flip herself up onto the torso behind the cockpit, and somersault onto the head of the mechanical beast. Dropping to a knee, she banged on the access hatch at her feet with the hilt of her primary saber. Her senses heightened to levels she had never known herself capable. She could hear active whispers from the cockpit below, a human and a Twi'lek, both male, contemplating opening the hatch. I am a friend, Ahsoka called through the duranium and durasteel armor. She could hear the debating cease as the swivel on the internal locking mechanism rotated with a metallic scrape before a familiar face emerged. Takruta, what are you doing? The familiar face had an accompanying familiar voice. She would have sworn she was looking at Rex, if not for the oddly formed tattoo covering the man's bald head and a lack of facial hair. I am Ahsoka Tano. Keep your fire focused on the ground. Let me worry about incoming fighters. Although she hadn't meant the admission of her name to register with the man, she could see his eyes widen slightly upon hearing it, and a sly smile betraying his hard edges as he brought a hand to his forehead in salute. Understood, Commander. As the hatch closed again without the metallic locking sound, Ahsoka found herself in the throes of nostalgia, igniting her sabers with the crack of both wrists. She glanced back down toward Rex and Kawani, who had formed a flanking perimeter around Nara. Ahsoka nodded toward them both before the roar of ion engines brought her attention back to the foreground. 3 incoming Imperial TIE fighters were bearing down upon the walker, unleashing a strafing hail of blaster fire into the ground. She planted her feet as the pilot below guided the ATST diligently to the side with a complicated shuffling of the machine's appendages, the head swiveling to the left to compensate for the trajectory before unleashing all 4 heavy blasters into the lead fighter. The ensuing ball of flame threatened to rupture the fighter to its right, whose pilot was deft enough to roll out of the way. The fighter on the left, taking exception to the walker's presence, rolled similarly and back into line of fire with its own stream of green energy. Ahsoka could time the bursts and dip low to prevent one of the beams from tearing through the pilot house. deflecting it into the debris cloud that only seemed to gather in intensity. The next 3 bolts fired in precisely the same sync as they had previously, Ahsoka turning them all back into the fighter with explosive results. She turned her attention to the third fighter, only to see a white-hot bolt of energy tear through its solar panels and reduce the craft to its spherical cockpit before it, too, was reduced to explosive fury upon contact with the hard ground below. Ahsoka turned to see Kawani lowering her A-180, knowing it wasn't the first time the Mirialan had reduced an Imperial TIE to rubble with the weapon. Perfect, Nara. Maintain your focus and let the Force guide your thoughts. Zana whispered her intentions into Nara's mind as she continued working the meditation. You see how strong you can be, simply by letting yourself become who you are meant to. Nara acknowledged the sentiment, but continued focusing on channeling the wrath of Ambria itself into the Togruta's efforts, offering the precision of the Force into the sabers at Ahsoka's command. Nara could sense the ire of Ambria within its full scope, wanting to be free of conflict at all costs, but something more personal, more profound inside its soundless wailing. You are feeling the pain of corruption, Nara. Ambria has been afflicted for eons by spirits severe and extreme in their resolve to escape bondage. Zana continued quietly and softly so as not to disrupt Nara's concentration. These are the elements that have drawn us here, why I kept coming back even in life, why Master Thon has resided here millennia, and why Tsar had taken it upon himself to monitor the Matrix. This planet is a prison, Nara returned in thought alone, careful not to sever the intense concentration the meditation needed. Even with your Matrix in my possession, you cannot leave. Master Thon will cease to be this day as the waters of Lake Naath will finally be cleansed. Master Zar will be free of his charge. Nara hesitated as she felt her concentration waver. It is inevitable, Nara. Do not think about it. Zana responded, knowing where Nara was headed. Just focus for the time being. Nara could feel an inexplicable sorrow beginning to grip her core as she tightened her eyes in concentration. She felt the pain of Ambria, the weight of its tragic past, begin to manifest through her imagination. Death, beyond Nara's comprehension, lied in every centimeter of the planet's surface, as well as the layers of rock underneath. Nara had seen what the dark side was capable of through the lens of planetary destruction, either outright or over time. This, however, was more tragic and sinister. Ambria had, long ago, become the crossroads of fate and destiny, where the basic needs of life would be thrust into their most extreme forms. Something not caused by either the light or the dark, but a combination of the effects caused by the clashing of both. Nara saw the irony as it stared her square in the face. We are doing the same to her now. Nara, it is inevitable. There is nothing that you are doing now, nor could ever, that would have either impeded or assisted what was set in motion before my time, Zana answered her thought. It precedes my master, and even the Brotherhood of Darkness that preceded him. Ambria will be free of its pain, mistress, Nara thought. It will be, Nara. When you are prepared to come home, it will be here for you, Zana said, the words that she knew Nara needed to hear. Nara was silent on the subject as she poured more of her concentration into the meditation again, assisting Kawani's shot as it tore through the solar wings. She was immediately assaulted in thought as Ahsoka was startled herself. What had been an easy transaction of sorts was amounting to child's play in her mind, as a looming threat made its presence known in her thoughts and her physical self. The one Sidious had sent to retrieve her, to take her from her home and subject her to countless forms of torment, was approaching. Vader was here. Get those units planetside, Captain. I need my full contingent, General Veers shouted at the diminutive hollow image of his duty captain aboard the Executor. Launch the Titans. What are you waiting for? Sir, the Admiral is engaged in evasive maneuvers and contradicts my orders, stating as much. I know you need them groundside, but he insists he will not expose his hangars to enemy fire. the duty captain responded. Am I to understand that we will not even have any further fighter cover then? Veers said, his features hardening to stone-cold directness. The hollow image was silent momentarily before General Veers shook his head in frustration and terminated the emitter. Sir, enemy artillery from both ridges are focusing on our center. Long range, minimal threat, but I am certain we haven't seen full potential yet, the gunnery officer said as the pilot beside him guided the metallic beast with methodic precision and ground-shaking authority. Long-range scans are inconclusive through that haze, he said, pointing a gloved finger toward the debris clouds swarming the eastern horizon. They are trying to do nothing less than split the forces we do have, Veers said in a response of his own, reaching for the comlink in his helmet. All units ignore diversionary fire and continue toward Lord Vader's position. We will sweep the northern cliffs, keep us out of range of the artillery on the southern cliffs, and out of sight from everything to the north. Maintain delta pattern and keep your eyes open for enemy units. His gunnery officer turned in his seat. Ignoring the cliffs doesn't mean the units won't reallocate, sir. What of our rear? Veers was silent for a moment as the answer to that question was still hangered in the bowels of the executor. As if in response, the hollow emitter chimed with an incoming message. He brought his gaze down from his forward view to activate the device before him. General, I think I may have a solution to your dilemma. Give me a few minutes to allow your duty captain the window he needs to get those Titans off the executor. In the meantime, we will launch fighter escort and do our best to maintain air superiority over your operational area. Grand Admiral Tethys delivered the news his own fleet admiral hadn't seen fit to convey. That is very welcome news, Grand Admiral, thank you. General Veers responded, the emitter ceasing on the distal end. That should sufficiently answer your question, Pital, he said to his gunnery officer. Captain Nox Sellicott placed both of his massive hands upon the armrests of his seat and pushed himself up to his booted feet. Crossing his tight, thick arms before his chest, he proceeded at a casual pace toward the forward viewport. Built to give its passengers an uninhibited view of the ribbons of hyperspace travel, the scope of its construction also enabled the ship's captain to entertain views at his leisure. I am sure they never had this in mind, Nock thought to himself as he approached the reinforced transparisteel panels, set into the nose of the vessel 3 times his height. Sentry and dorsal gunners, prepare for port roll, he called out to the active technet. Half turning, he glared over his shoulder. Helm, I want port cannon roll, 15-degree downward angle. He paused, returning his view to the ports before him. Make that 18 degrees. Sir, Tam squeaked out, isn't it enough to keep the executor from delivering anything else planetside? It is worth noting that Ozzel's ineptitude is more than compensated for with Tethys' presence. Freebo was sure the words would anger the Deveronian, but nonetheless, they needed to be said. Perhaps you are right, Tam. Greed can make for lonely partnerships, Nox said, blowing out a breath. Helm, belay trajectory, give me port roll, steady on. He updated with an approving eye toward the squat Celestin. On my mark. Sir, Shala and Reese are in position. You have their mark, a young male. Zabrak called over the bridge's comm. Now or never, Nock thought, hating how the cliché was so right. Mark! Fire all forward long-range batteries, nearest targets. We're not looking for heroics, only to draw those forces farther out from orbit, Captain Shalab bristled in her Togrutan accent. She felt the old Venator shudder under the resultant recoil of the refurbished DBY-827 heavy laser turrets and subsequent unloading of all forward proton torpedo tubes. Peripheral sidelong glances from her vantage presented a similar visage of other vessels under her command. Blue hyphens streaked their way toward the far superior armor and shielding of the current Imperial capital ships, knowing how ineffectual the impacts would be. However, the collective tactical decision to use Imperial aggression against itself found no argument from anyone, as the ship shuddered again from another wave of arms, streaking away toward the contingent of Imperial warships. Shala watched with hopeful desperation as she coaxed Tethys to make the pivotal mistake of committing even a small delegation of vessels to deal with this outside threat. She knew Reese was pulling on those levers of hope, knowing he was firing away like they were. Shala almost pitied Ozzel as she'd come to know the man vicariously through Captain Nock and General Vomend, and she couldn't understand why Vader hadn't chosen someone else entirely to lead his fleet. Someone like Tethys, she thought, knowing the Grand Admiral well from the numerous Outer Rim skirmishes the two had unwittingly engaged. Another volley of laser fire erupted from the batteries as another group of torpedoes rushed forward from the aged lady. She tapped her earbead. "Reese, anything?" her accent fresh on her tongue. "We had several leads fall back, Shala. Tethys must have taken direct command of the 5th, he responded in her ear. "We must be cautious, Reese. Nock, keep an eye on your scopes. Expect reinforcements. Reese, they haven't been able to hinder Vomend's landing whatsoever, and if those ships haven't committed fully to blockade the planet, then something else must be coming. I suggest we belay fire and concentrate our forces on the perimeter to prepare for it." "Copy, Shala. The overall lack of fighters has me concerned. We should be swarmed with them by now," Reese responded. Shala placed both hands on her hips as she turned from the viewport and focused on her scanning team. Canting a hip upward, she knew she was right in assuming something else was on its way. The call was hers alone, and what to do about it, as she did her best to replay the narrative since their arrival. If we close ranks, we fall under their fire. If we don't, we leave Nock exposed over the long term. She thought, knowing full well Temple Garden could hold its own longer than the average Star Destroyer. However, there were also 2 dreadnoughts trading space in its wake. Nock could maintain his ruse with the Executor until Relentless became directly involved. Shala waved toward her comms officer to get the man's attention, then circled a finger over her head. With the man's thumbs up, she lifted her head slightly. "Listen up, everyone. We came here to nullify any further ground involvement from the Imperial 5th Fleet, a portion of which is currently under heavy fire from our own Vomend. As it turns out, through Nock's efforts, that directive has now allowed us to drive it wedge deep into the Imperial Navy altogether. I am convinced reinforcements are forthcoming, so our time is limited. I will initiate attack pattern Zeta 3. Nock, converge on our pincer point orbital. Reese and I will cross over and skip blind to wrap around positions on their flanks. Reese, you will have the mark. Captain, do not forget the SDs that went dark, polarizing the planet," Nock replied cautiously. Shala only chuckled in response. "Forget them, Captain? I think not, my dear Nock. I am counting on them."